$51 million. One of Hollywood's most powerful stars on the planet, the director of The Heartbreak Kid, and a studio CEO who allegedly decided, before a single review had been published, that he wanted this film dead on arrival. That's not speculation dressed up as drama. That's just what happened with some of the most expensive theatrical implosions in Hollywood history. Between 1987 and 1989, the major studios hemorrhaged money on films that, by any reasonable measure, should never have collapsed the way they did. We are talking about productions with genuine talent attached, real budgets behind them, and, in at least one case, 4 Academy Award nominations, sitting right alongside a catastrophic theatrical run. 7 films, 7 very different roads to financial ruin. Some of these you will remember clearly, some you will have actively suppressed, and at least one will make you wonder whether the film was ever the actual problem. Ishtar arrived in cinemas on May 15, 1987, carrying a $51 million production budget at a time when Beverly Hills Cop 2 cost $27 million and Top Gun had been made for $15 million. Columbia Pictures had 2 of the biggest names in the industry, Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, playing a pair of magnificently talentless lounge singers who wind up entangled in CIA politics somewhere in the Moroccan desert. You'd think that premise, those names, and that level of financial commitment would be close to bulletproof. Columbia's own chief executive, it turned out, had a different opinion entirely. David Putnam had just arrived as Columbia's new head, and here's the thing. He had previously gone up against Warren Beatty at the Academy Awards, his Chariots of Fire against Beatty's Reds, and Putnam had won. Now Beatty was on his turf, making a $51 million film Putnam hadn't greenlit. Before Ishtar even opened, Putnam was publicly criticizing the production, its stars, and its cost to anyone in the press who would listen, and the press ran with every word. The narrative that Ishtar was already a disaster got cemented before most audiences had seen a single frame of the actual film. The domestic gross came in at $14.4 million against that $51 million production budget, a figure that excludes marketing costs entirely, which meant Columbia was staring at losses estimated above $40 million in 1987 money. The financial fallout ran deep enough to contribute to Columbia being restructured, merged with TriStar Pictures, and eventually sold to Sony. What genuinely interests me about Ishtar, though, is who came to its defense afterward. Martin Scorsese loves it. Quentin Tarantino has championed it publicly and repeatedly. Edgar Wright has cited it as underrated. Roger Ebert called it a lifeless, massive, lumbering exercise in failed comedy. And Ebert was a sharp critic who usually got these things right. Yet the film has a vocal and credible defense squad that has only grown in the decades since release. Ishtar wasn't purely a box office failure in the conventional sense. It was a film buried by the very person who was supposed to be selling it, and those are 2 entirely different categories of disaster. Speaking of productions undone from the inside, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace opened on July 24, 1987, a single day after its royal premiere in London, an event attended by Prince Charles and Princess Diana. The regal send-off provided no insulation whatsoever against what followed. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace had a structural problem that no amount of royal attendance could address. The Cannon Group, the production company run by Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, had acquired the Superman rights and originally budgeted the film at $36 million. Then, shortly before filming commenced at Elstree Studios in September 1986, they cut that figure to $17 million, which was roughly half the original commitment, applied to exactly the same scope of production. The British special effects crew brought in to replace the team from the first 3 Superman films operated on a fraction of what those earlier productions had available. You'd think that having your budget might prompt at least one serious conversation about scaling back the script's ambitions. That conversation apparently never happened. Christopher Reeve had agreed to return partly for a larger fee and partly because the production had offered him creative input on a story dealing with nuclear disarmament. a cause that genuinely mattered to him. He received the creative credit. The film received a 10% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a domestic gross of $15.6 million against that $17 million production budget, which sounds almost survivable until you factor in marketing costs and the ambitions a franchise of this scale was expected to meet. 45 minutes of footage were removed after negative test screenings, plans for a fifth film were canceled outright, and the Superman franchise went dark for nearly 2 decades until Superman Returns arrived in 2006. Reeve himself later expressed regret about making it. That's not just a flop, that's a franchise execution carried out with the budget of a mid-range thriller. This one occupies a strange emotional territory because it is so bizarre, it almost tips into comedy before circling back around to something more uncomfortable. Leonard Part 6 opened on December 18, 1987, with a $24 million production budget and a separate $5 million promotional campaign behind it. The man who starred in it, produced it, and wrote the story publicly told audiences not to go see it in the weeks before release. Bill Cosby did not hint at dissatisfaction or offer carefully worded reservations. He went on television and told people directly not to waste their money on Leonard Part 6, which is, as far as anyone can reasonably determine, without precedent in the history of major studio filmmaking. The domestic gross landed at $4,615,255, which against a $24 million budget represents one of the more complete collapses of the era. The Cineplex Odeon theater chain, at that point the 4th largest in the United States, had also refused to screen the film, and here is where it gets genuinely strange, because that decision had nothing to do with the quality of Leonard Part 6. Cineplex was retaliating against Columbia for rescheduling The Last Emperor at the last minute. So the film's own star was publicly advising people to stay away, and the 4th largest cinema chain in the country had pulled it from their screens over a scheduling dispute that predated the film's release entirely. Gene Siskel awarded it 0 stars and declared it worse than Ishtar. 3 Golden Raspberries followed, covering Worst Picture, Worst Actor, and Worst Screenplay. Cosby accepted the awards by requesting they be made from 24-karat gold and Italian marble, before displaying them on The Tonight Show and announcing he had swept the entire category. Cosby's salary alone had consumed $6 million of the $24 million production budget. No satirist could have written that. The reality was simply too committed to itself. This next one runs in almost the opposite direction because nearly everyone involved appeared to recognize the incoming disaster early and attempted, with varying degrees of success, to get out before it arrived. Caddyshack 2 opened on July 22, 1988. The original Caddyshack from 1980 had earned $60 million worldwide on a $4.8 million budget, which gave Warner Brothers a reasonable foundation for believing a sequel carried commercial potential. What the studio perhaps underweighted was that almost nobody who had made the first film wanted anything to do with the second. Bill Murray declined to return, choosing to make Scrooged instead, a decision he has never appeared to regret publicly. Rodney Dangerfield withdrew in October 1987, less than a month before filming was scheduled to begin, and with $2 million already committed to pre-production, on the basis that the script was not working and he did not want his name attached to the result. Warner Brothers filed a breach of contract suit against Dangerfield, which the two parties eventually settled for an undisclosed figure. Director Alan Arkush later spoke openly about the situation, noting that the script was not in shape, Murray was gone, and now Dangerfield had left as well. Warner Brothers pushed ahead regardless, insisting on a summer 1988 release date, which left approximately 6 months for principal photography and post-production on a film that had already lost its 2 most commercially reliable cast members. Chevy Chase returned as the only original cast member and has since acknowledged publicly that he regretted the decision. The domestic gross came in at approximately $11.8 million against a production budget estimated somewhere between $20 and $25 million, though that budget figure is not confirmed across multiple reliable sources. What is confirmed, consistently and across decades of retrospective coverage, is that Caddyshack 2 ranks among the worst sequels ever committed to film, and the people who made it tend to agree. Sometimes the talent reads the situation more accurately than the studio does. The tone shifts here because this particular entry involves 4 genuine Academy Award nominations, a director with a documented history of battling studio interference, and one of the more brazen acts of institutional sabotage in 1980s Hollywood. Terry Gilliam's The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, starring John Neville, Eric Idle, Uma Thurman, and Oliver Reed, received nominations for Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Makeup, and Best Visual Effects. Against those 4 nominations, it grossed approximately $8 million domestically against a production budget that had escalated from an original $23.5 million to a disputed figure somewhere around $46 million, though Gilliam contested the higher number publicly. The film opened in West Germany in December 1988 and performed respectably there, pulling $853,515 in its opening week across 252 screens, which demonstrated that international audiences were prepared to engage with the material. The American market was a different situation entirely. Columbia, holding the U.S. distribution rights, gave the film a limited March 1989 release supported by minimal promotional activity, and Gilliam, who had already spent years fighting Universal over the American cut of Brazil, was direct in his accusation that Columbia had deliberately undermined the release. A crew member at Peerless Camera, which handled the film's special effects work, described being promised a completion bonus, then being informed the bonus would not be paid because the executive involved did not want to appear to be doing anything that benefited Gilliam. That detail is specific enough in its pettiness to be genuinely striking. A film collecting 4 Academy Award nominations does not represent a creative failure. What The Adventures of Baron Munchausen represents is a distribution failure dressed in a creative failure's clothing, and the two things are not remotely the same. The Criterion Collection released the film on 4K Ultra HD and Blu-ray in January 2023, which is the kind of institutional recognition that tends to arrive about 3 decades too late. And then there's Mac and Me, which arrived on August 12, 1988, through Orion Pictures, and which can be described most accurately as a feature-length McDonald's advertisement that also happens to contain an alien. The production budget ran to approximately $13 million, the domestic gross landed around $6.4 million, and the film's relationship to E.T. the Extraterrestrial extended well beyond casual influence into something closer to structural replication, right down to a child protagonist, a creature in a suit, and government agents as the antagonists. McDonald's branding appears throughout Mac and Me with a frequency and enthusiasm that suggests the marketing department may have had final cut approval. A scene set inside an actual McDonald's restaurant functions less as a plot point than as a sponsored segment with production value. Ronald McDonald appears in the film and subsequently collected a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst New Star, which remains one of the more surreal moments in the entire history of the Razzies. Here's what I'll give Mac and Me though, and I mean this without irony. The lead actor was Jade Caligari, a child who uses a wheelchair in real life, and his character uses one throughout the film. In 1988, casting a child with a disability as the central hero of a mainstream studio production was genuinely unusual, and the film deserves acknowledgement for that, even as it deserves everything else it received. It found the worst conceivable way to do something forward-thinking, which is a very specific kind of achievement. The film has since developed a substantial cult following, driven almost entirely by Paul Rudd's long-running gag on Conan O'Brien's programs, where Rudd has repeatedly substituted a Mac and Me clip whenever he was ostensibly there to promote his actual current film. He maintained that gag for over 2 decades. The clip never loses its effect. Rent-A-Cop, released in limited form in December 1987 before going wide in January 1988, represents a very specific late 80s phenomenon, namely the act of pairing 2 major stars whose commercial drawing power had declined considerably, then hoping the combined marquee value would add up to something greater than its component parts. Burt Reynolds and Liza Minnelli star in a mismatched buddy cop romance hybrid distributed by Kings Road Entertainment on a production budget of approximately $15 million. The theatrical gross came in somewhere around $487,000, though that figure derives from a single source and warrants caution, and what is not in dispute is that Rent-A-Cop was pulled from cinemas almost immediately after opening, having received virtually no promotional support from the distributor. Reynolds was navigating a commercially difficult stretch at this point in his career, and Minnelli was similarly working through a period well removed from her peak box office years. You'd think two icons in decline might at least generate curiosity as a pairing, a certain nostalgia-driven attendance from audiences who remembered both of them at their best. The answer, as it turned out, was no. Rent-A-Cop exists in the historical record primarily because somebody has to come last. The thread connecting these 7 films is worth sitting with for a moment. Some of these were creative failures in the straightforward sense, productions where the script, the casting, or the execution simply did not work. Others were production failures, where budget cuts, lost talent, and impossible timelines made the outcome almost inevitable before cameras rolled. And at least 2 of them, Ishtar and the Adventures of Baron Munchausen, look far less like failures and far more like casualties of studio politics that had almost nothing to do with what actually appeared on screen. The late 1980s were a period when studios were being acquired, restructured, and steered by executives whose agendas sometimes bore little relationship to the films those studios were releasing. The films that got caught in that institutional crossfire did not always fail because they deserved to. Some of them are still being rediscovered today, still finding the audiences that the original releases denied them. Hollywood keeps its receipts. The full story just takes time to surface. The pattern of studios working against their own releases through executive rivalry, deliberate budget reduction, or straightforward institutional chaos runs through the entire history of this industry, and that is exactly the kind of story this channel keeps digging into.